Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. This morning's briefing delves into a subject that hasn't gotten as much attention as it probably deserves, but it's certainly something that you're going to be hearing more of in the coming years. We're talking about the so-called Seven Mountains Mandate. There's many names for it. Some people call it Christian Dominionism, others New Apostolic Reformation. No matter what the title, it's all the same thing, a blatantly political ideology trying to masquerade itself as being a religious movement. But everything these people talk about has to do with worldly power. Now, the followers of this doctrine believe that God has chosen Christians to dominate the so-called seven key mountains or spheres of American public life. That is, family, religion, media, entertainment, business, government, and education. Now, if all of that sounds familiar to people who listen to the black media, it should, because Neely Fuller laid out that white supremacy controls what he calls the 9 major areas of human activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war/counter-war. So you see there's a heck of a lot of overlap there, isn't it? And that's no accident. Neely Fuller's list covered all the same arenas as the so-called Seven Mountains Mandate, except Fuller added 2 more, sex and war. Now, when it comes to concepts like the Apostolic Reformation, or to more specifically things like the Seven Mountains Mandate, there are a number of names that have been attached to these movements. But one name that kept coming up the most is a guy named Lance Wallnau. Not surprisingly, he's a good old boy preacher from Texas, Dallas to be precise. And he's been the main one who's basically gotten his name attached to the phrase Seven Mountains Mandate. He even wrote a book about it. This Wallnau character calls himself a prophet. I'm not making that up. He actually describes himself as a prophet. He also likes to pal around with the likes of Charlie Kirk. And while the Bible makes it very clear that Christianity does not and has never had a political party, Wallnau certainly does. He's hosted a series of get-out-the-vote rallies that try to present themselves as worship gatherings. But the more you look at the things that he's written and the things that he says and the approach that he takes to this religious movement, you notice that this guy comes off as just another garden-variety Republican National Committee shill. This is not a man who's trying to win hearts for God. This is a man who's trying to win elections for his own personal interest. But truth be told, regardless of whose names happen to be most closely associated with this movement, I don't think that it pays for us to get too hung up on specific personalities. Keep in mind, white supremacy is very good at creating hydras, a kind of monster where even if you chop off one of its heads, 2 more will grow to take its place. But this is the guy who many white media outlets are crediting as having come up with the term Seven Mountains Mandate. This is the guy who's running around spouting this stuff. He's the one pushing this ideology. And the guy's running around calling himself a prophet. You know, prophets were usually called that by other people. They didn't run around saying, I am a prophet. They sat back and they performed their miracles, they preached their sermons, and they let other people sing their praises. But not Wallnau. He is a shameless self-promoter. Just like any other politician, huh? The Seven Mountains proponents believe the 10 Commandments, or biblical law, should be the foundation of American life, and that God wants hardline Christians to be in control of everything from corporate America to Washington, D.C. to local classrooms. Now, all of this flies in the face of Christianity. First of all, what part of the Bible talks about taking control of business? Jesus preached endlessly about avoiding the love of money, how difficult it is for rich people to enter heaven, and he excoriated his followers to never worship the god of Mammon. Mammon was the god of money. Basically, if your business wasn't doing so well, you would make some offerings to Mammon and hopefully he would increase the foot traffic to your store. Jesus also threw the money changers out of the temple, you'll recall. Most of what he did in the Bible actually dealt with combating the love of money. So when it came to economics, he said, store up your riches in heaven. But this crowd is only interested in pursuing riches right here on earth. Also, since when does the Bible say anything about media or entertainment, much less taking control of these things? I'd like to know, what was Jesus Christ's favorite TV channel then? What TV shows were the disciples watching? What was their favorite movie? Taking control of labor? All Jesus said about labor was that an employer should pay whatever he promised to pay his employees, even if it's different from one person to the next. He didn't ask that it be uniform with the pay, but he did say, make sure you pay people whatever it is you promise to pay them. And as for taking control of government, Jesus explicitly said his government was not of this earth, that the power Christianity seeks is spiritual. Jesus didn't want political power, and make no mistake, If he had wanted to, he could have easily gone for it. Jesus directly challenged Rome. Now, this was an extremely bright 27-year-old rabbi who was running around telling people he was the Son of God. He was charismatic, bold, intelligent, and clever. He had all the tools of a skilled politician and statesman, and yet Jesus never sought political office, never even talked about it, never even thought about it. About the closest Jesus ever came to being in the political arena was his brief encounter with Pontius Pilate, and I think we all know how that one turned out. And there was a very good reason Jesus never so much as thought about pursuing politics. It was because to do so would be to repudiate his own divinity. Jesus' entire message is that man is a broken creature, and that nothing devised by the hand or mind of man can fix what's wrong with him, because man's problem is a spiritual one. No machine, no potion, no political system, no set of rules, philosophical or ideological dogma can fix man's problems. Only God can. That was Jesus' entire message. For Jesus to join in the political squabbles of human beings would be for him to validate that man can fix his own problems. All man has to do is sit around and think long enough until he comes up with a political system that's good enough to be a substitute for God's judgment, or a voting system for a politician. And if that's the case, man doesn't need a savior. He's perfectly capable of saving himself. See, that's why Jesus never sought political office, and he never commanded his disciples to do it either. If God wanted to pursue control of all these things that these so-called 7 mountains are about, don't you think he would have written that in the Bible somewhere? So since none of this came from Jesus or God, where is it coming from? These are people seeking worldly power, corporeal power. Now, as with so much else in the political sphere, these loudmouth zealots were in the same camp as the likes of Ed Blum, largely ignored, that is, until Donald Trump ran for office and realized that these hypocrites were as corrupt as he was. And so a man who was infamous for his womanizing and bragging about it, and also infamous for running a casino, apparently gambling is not against Christianity, and a man who was famous for loving money and callously telling people they were fired, well, these evangelicals felt that this was what now constituted a true man of God. All he had to do was promise to do what they told him. And the same way George W. Bush used so-called faith-based initiatives to gain evangelical support in the political arena, Trump would now lend his brash, aggressive rhetoric to his empty boast about getting God back in schools. And this pleased the religious right, because that's exactly the kind of over-the-top aggression for their agenda that they wanted to see. Who cared that this man was nothing more than a heathen? What they liked was the fact that he would bring his own sharp-elbow style to getting done what they wanted as far as they were concerned. In their eyes, all of his sins were now forgiven. It also didn't hurt that with Donald Trump's track record of being a bigot, the religious right understood that when they said God, that simply meant getting rid of anything that indicted white racism. So these forces have now become quite emboldened, but we have to add that Democrats have done absolutely nothing to push back against them, which they could very easily do. And that's the factor that I think that has most emboldened these people the most, but Trump's encouragement and support for them can't be overstated. Since the time of the so-called Holy Roman Empire, European leaders in particular have long recognized that they could control the masses by getting the popes to decree that King so-and-so over there has a divine right to rule. He's a holy and godly man, so the people better obey him and don't even think about not paying your taxes. European despots from King Charles VIII of France back in the 15th century, all the way up to Nazi Germany in the 20th, easily made friends with the papacy in Rome in return for worldly power. Go ahead and endorse these men and say that God's on their side, and you'll have at least 1 billion Catholics who'll go right along with it without even thinking. Political leaders and church leaders have long realized that they could play off of one another and they could actually achieve their own perverted kind of synergy. And that's the reason why the church lending the good offices of God himself to some political scheme is not new at all. In fact, it's quite old and quite common. And these people who espouse these kind of ideas are always talking about patriotism. That's one of the things they love to do. As a wise man once said, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Because these people, they don't love America. They love whatever backward portion of the county they live in. And since when does love of country have anything to do with Christianity? Jesus Christ was not a patriot. He said, love thy neighbor, not love thy country. He certainly didn't. Jesus never even talked about patriotism. He wasn't about loyalty to a country. He was about loyalty to a kingdom in heaven. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, spent some time in Egypt, then a spell living in Nazarene, and died in Jerusalem. He was no patriot. He was, to put it most loosely, a cosmopolite. And yet these Seven Mountains adherents preach that God is an American, and that what they call American values are in fact godly values. But when they define what those values are, it's the same old white identity nonsense. And speaking of this whole Seven Mountains mandate movement deciding to back these anti-black initiatives and all of this slavery nonsense, keep in mind, this Wallnau character personally backed Doug Mastriano's failed gubernatorial run in Pennsylvania. Mastriano, you'll recall, is the guy who also made national headlines because he chose to dress up as a Confederate soldier for the Army War College's faculty photo that he took part in. They were supposed to be celebrating basically American soldiers through the centuries, and he thought the best way to celebrate American soldiers was to dress up as one of the traitors who killed over 100,000 American soldiers. No matter what Bible verse they may try to misuse to justify their rhetoric, what they're doing is nothing more than a clumsy front for white pride organizations, and they lie about it, as they always do, right up until the moment they finally seize political power or get some of their policies passed. And when that happens, then they put aside all pretense of who and what they really are, and they start giving the Nazi salutes live on air and preaching their racialist nonsense. In this case, these white supremacist power mongers have totally removed the middleman altogether and are just openly declaring that they're holy in and of themselves. Everything these people say is the exact opposite of the Bible, to the point that it's a joke. But of course, none of them have to worry about anyone debunking their talking points or pointing out the excruciating contradictions and inconsistencies of what they say, for the same reason they never have to worry about their political or legal talking points being debunked. The people who go along with their idiocy already know that what they're saying is a pack of lies, but they also know that their power depends on them all being on code. And that code isn't about truth or the scriptures. It's about whatever is to their own advantage. If they actually had to live their lives telling the truth and live by that truth, most of them wouldn't make it a single day, and they know it. It's like I've always told you, white supremacy doesn't have any principles. It only has situational ethics and moral relativism. They will say whatever they think will benefit them at that moment, and then the very next day they'll say exactly the opposite if they think that will benefit them. This is how you have a situation where the same Christians who didn't have a problem giving the middle finger to Donald Trump when he was palling around with the Clintons, well, now that Trump seems to be backing up their agenda, they've overlooked all of this man's rampant sinfulness, and they're saying, well, we're overlooking that because we're voting for a president, not a priest. Yeah, whatever will benefit them in the moment, and they'll gladly overlook the fact that this is a man they know from experience to be a pathological liar. Preachers and theologians almost never discuss the fact that the Bible does not endorse taking control of any of the quote-unquote levers of power in society, and the white right, of course, doesn't dare talk about that at all because it refutes their pathetic Bible thumping. When you see these conservative hypocristians, they're doing the same old good white Christian spiel that this country has always engaged in. The people talking the Christian dominionism stuff realize that when they talk about their alleged idea of a godly society, it's merely the same old white supremacist racial hierarchy. When they say God doesn't see color, what that's code for is don't call out any of the historical racism that white society has practiced, and we mean God doesn't care about that. He doesn't see our skin, which means he doesn't see the system of racial privilege we put in place either. And he approves of anything we do to perpetuate this racial order that we set up. That he set up. Sanctified racism is not new at all. In fact, white supremacy's original defenses of its anti-black racism came out of religion. Everything from the Hamitic curse to tell black people that slaves are commanded by the Bible to love their masters. Religion was the original ironclad, inarguable justification for anti-black racism. As science advanced and religion began to be questioned more and more, eventually the racist had to resort to inventing scientific-sounding talking points meant to accomplish that same goal. History was banned and suppressed, and instead we got hoaxes like Egyptology. Gone was the Hamitic curse, and instead we got crackpot racial theories claiming black people were intellectually inferior, and other insane rantings like drapetomania. Some white racists would take their own anti-black prejudices and biases and invent some erudite-sounding term to try to justify it. Now we see them cherry-picking pieces of the Bible and trying to use it for the same purpose. What we're seeing here is a revival, pun intended, of that same old racist tactic, except it's being blended with and joined with their scientific racism. We're seeing a fusion of the two. The black liberation struggle in this country proved that American society, and the dominant society that it benefits, is not moral, and seizing the moral high ground, white supremacy couldn't claim to be justified or even good, and without justification for its practices, it couldn't justify its existence either. If what you're doing isn't right and beneficial, then that means it's wrong and destructive. White supremacy couldn't justify itself, and in order to maintain the racial pyramid scheme it put in place to justify the unearned and undeserved wealth that it stole and comfort that it took from black people and gave to itself, they had to find a way to say that they're not immoral. Only problem is, they can't. And so we're seeing right-wing politicians passing laws to teach that slavery was good, laws to ban anyone from teaching actual history, and to try to scare people into silence with laws that make it legal to sue teachers for telling the truth about race in America. And of course, there's been wealthy white racists funding and propping up various lawsuits meant to do the same things in the judicial arena. The racists have long understood that they lost the culture a long time ago. That's part of the reason why they've had to resort to laws and such. See, when you actually have the culture, as black people do, you don't need laws. It's part of the reason why these guys are so angry about so-called cancel culture. See, when you have the society that goes along with something and they don't need laws to enforce it, what that means is that is the actual power in the society. That shows you where the society's mind is actually at. What you're seeing are a bunch of schemes by the white right to try to force people to do what they're told by these guys because they don't have the culture. The culture's not with them. Christopher Rufo wrote an entire book about this fact, so they recognize exactly who and what they are, and they understand how the society really sees them. This is about them giving the middle finger and saying, hey, God told us that we can force you to do whatever we want, and if you refuse, we'll kill you. That's where this goes next. These guys were already defeated overwhelmingly and crushed, so now we see them trying to declare that they're white, they're in charge, and God told them they're supposed to control every major arena of the society, whether you like it or not. And if you disagree or refuse to obey them, then that means you're in league with the devil. Naturally, the proponents of so-called Seven Mountains ideology have been pushing all kinds of extremist doctrines in schools, sanctifying white supremacy. When you see people like Ron DeSantis attacking critical race theory and forcing curriculum on the state to teach that slavery was a good thing, which was a direct response to the 1619 Project, keep in mind, that's actually right out of the Seven Mountains playbook. They also attack critical race theory too, and they say children need to be taught to love America no matter what America's done to black people. And you can't be teaching that slavery was bad. Why? That's teaching you to hate white people. Of course, all of these shrieking morons who would show up and do their little performance art at those school board meetings, they have absolutely nothing to say about the fact that their chosen governor, Ron DeSantis, is having children taught that slavery was a good thing. Now, what part of the Bible did Jesus say slavery is something that everybody should do? God wants everyone to be a slave. Of course not. They know exactly what kind of fire they're playing with. See, the conservatives are just like the Pharisees, constantly trying to lay traps for others, and the chosen tool that the Pharisees constantly used was the law, both Hebraic law and just as often Roman law. When you see the Chris Rufos and Ron DeSantis and Ed Blums either trying to invent laws or encouraging corrupt judges to legislate from the bench, this is just like what the Pharisees would do. It's a tactic that's as old as the Bible. When the white right invokes God or Jesus, it's not because they actually believe in either one of them, because they don't. The white supremacists think that they are God. So whenever they read God in the Bible, they're thinking, that's us. It's talking about us. Remember, the white supremacists use their own tailored preachings of Christianity as a way to justify all their anti-black racism. They've been doing it for hundreds of years. During slavery, they had slave ships named things like the good ship Jesus. The places where they would auction the black people they enslaved had names like St. Augustine's Slave Market. So the enemy has practiced injecting Christianity, names, and wording into their racist practices all along. People like Jared Taylor, the white supremacist zealot, is himself the child of Christian missionaries. Jared Taylor, you'll recall, runs the extremist American Renaissance website, which Dylan Roof cited as the primary direct influence for the church massacre he carried out. And Taylor also frequently talked about the need for white power to seize control of every major arena of the society, and then to use those levers of power to undo the progress black Americans have brought about in this country. So this Seven Mountains doctrine was not at all the beginning of anything at all. It's not new. These people have been working to fuse right-wing politics with their phony claims of Christianity as a way to try to give their racism, greed, and lust for power the good offices of God himself. It's a kind of moral laundry scheme that they're trying to pull, but in reality, they're just another gang of racial ideologues trying to seize power. Bible thumping is merely their shtick. It's both their brand and their cheap way of trying to dissuade anyone from questioning them. After all, can you question God? No matter who their front men or front women may be, no matter what they may call themselves or what they claim to be about, this is not the introduction of anything new. It's an attempt to reimpose something very old. White supremacy has no new plays in its playbook. They just do the same thing, only more of it. But as black people, we're not going to be letting up on them at all. Because as we've shown for over 150 years, whenever these racists do get questioned and confronted by us, their mountains crumble. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Frederick Richburg, Dia Williams, Faith Speaks Life, Craig Simmons, and William. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.